Dawn, June 1944. On the island of Saipan, the man who had once unleashed hell on Pearl Harbor now sat surrounded by fire. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander who led Japan's most infamous attack, was trapped, cornered by the very navy he had once humiliated. American bombers filled the sky, battleships roared offshore, and the walls of his cave shook with every explosion. For Nagumo, this wasn't just defeat, it was retribution. The hunter of 1941 had become the hunted of 1944. This is the story of how America came for the man behind Pearl Harbor, and how his death became one of the most savage acts of justice in the Pacific War. Stay until the end and make sure to subscribe, because what happened to Admiral Nagumo is something history was never meant to forget. In the autumn of 1941, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was handed the most ambitious order in Japan's naval history, led a carrier strike force across 3,000 miles of open ocean, and crippled the United States Pacific Fleet. He hadn't planned the attack. That credit belonged to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, but it was Nagumo who would execute it. A cautious man by nature, he had spent most of his career commanding destroyers and cruisers, not aircraft carriers. Many of his peers doubted he was the right choice, but in Japan's rigid military hierarchy, obedience was absolute. On November 26, 1941, Nagumo's fleet, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 350 aircraft, departed from Hitokapu Bay under strict radio silence. Their mission was cloaked in secrecy so deep that even the pilots didn't know their target. Only Nagumo and a handful of officers understood the stakes. If the operation failed, Japan's empire would be doomed before the war even began. At dawn on December 7, 1941, the calm waters of Pearl Harbor erupted into chaos. Nagumo's first wave struck with devastating precision, torpedo bombers tearing through the moored U.S. fleet, dive bombers screaming from the clouds. Within minutes, battleships like the Arizona and Oklahoma were burning infernos. By the time the second wave withdrew, over 2,400 Americans were dead. Japan celebrated the strike as divine vengeance, and Nagumo was hailed as a national hero. He returned to Tokyo to parades, banners, and the emperor's praise. Yet, beneath the victory, doubts haunted him. Nagumo had refused Yamamoto's demand for a third wave to destroy America's fuel reserves and repair docks, targets that might have crippled the U.S. for years. He feared a counterattack, believing prudence would preserve his fleet. Instead, it preserved America's ability to strike back. That decision would mark him forever. The man who had delivered Japan's greatest triumph had unknowingly ensured its downfall. Across the Pacific, Americans swore revenge. Newspapers printed his name beside the flames of Pearl Harbor, and every pilot, every sailor, every Marine knew it. Someday, they would come for Admiral Nagumo. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force the world had ever seen. His carrier fleet dominated the Pacific, crushing opposition with terrifying efficiency. From the Philippines to the Indian Ocean, his planes sank Allied ships, destroyed bases, and spread panic across half the globe. For a time, Nagumo seemed untouchable. Tokyo hailed him as the man who had humbled the West, the admiral who carried Japan's destiny in his hands. But behind that reputation was a truth his officers quietly saw. Nagumo wasn't a visionary. He was cautious, methodical, and often afraid to take the kinds of risks that bold strategy required. He had inherited a weapon built for aggression, but lacked the instinct to wield it fully. In April 1942, he led the Kido Butai, Japan's carrier task force, in a massive raid across the Indian Ocean. His fleet sank the British carrier Hermes, the cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and dozens of smaller ships. For Japan, it was another triumph. Yet even then, cracks began to show. His subordinates complained that he hesitated too often, that he lacked Yamamoto's daring. The same conservative instincts that had made him cautious at Pearl Harbor were now slowing Japan's momentum. Yamamoto, ever the gambler, looked ahead to a decisive battle that would destroy the U.S. Navy once and for all. That plan would lead Nagumo to Midway, a battle that would change the war and destroy everything he had built. In June 1942, Nagumo sailed east with 4 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. His mission was to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and finish what Pearl Harbor had started. But what he didn't know was that the Americans had cracked Japan's naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his intelligence officers already knew the plan, the target, even the date. As Nagumo prepared his strike on Midway Island, the U.S. Navy waited. The ambush that followed was swift and merciless. In the early hours of June 4th, Nagumo's fleet came under attack from waves of American torpedo bombers. He launched fighters to counter them, not realizing that above the chaos, high-altitude dive bombers were already positioning for their run. When they struck, it was devastation. Within minutes, 3 of his carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, would follow hours later. Thousands of sailors and airmen died in a single morning. Nagumo stood on his flagship's deck, surrounded by smoke and burning oil, watching Japan's dreams of dominance sink beneath the waves. Midway shattered more than Japan's navy. It shattered Nagumo himself. His indecision during the battle, his failure to launch his planes at the right moment, became the stuff of bitter debate in Tokyo. He had hesitated again, torn between attacking the island and striking at the American carriers. That hesitation cost Japan its entire carrier corps and ended its ability to wage offensive war. When he returned home, there were no parades, no cheering crowds, only silence. He offered his resignation, but the Navy refused, unwilling to publicly disgrace one of its heroes. Instead, he was reassigned, his once glorious career quietly buried under shame. For America, Midway was vindication. The man who had struck Pearl Harbor had been defeated in kind, his fleet destroyed, his power broken. But for Nagumo, it was the beginning of a slow execution. Each battle Japan lost, each island America reclaimed, carried his name like a curse. The hunter who had once ruled the Pacific was now being hunted by fate itself, and the United States was just getting started. After Midway, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was a man haunted by ghosts. Ghosts of ships, pilots, and decisions that could not be undone. The Navy that once praised him now looked at him with quiet contempt. He was still respected publicly, still saluted as the architect of Pearl Harbor, but behind closed doors, he was spoken of as a man whose time had passed. Japan's momentum had been broken. Its carrier fleet was crippled. Its pilots, once the best in the world, now outnumbered and outmatched. Nagumo was transferred to less glamorous commands, far from the glory of the open sea. The proud admiral who had once commanded the Kido Butai now found himself shuffling between defensive assignments, reduced to holding lines rather than breaking them. By 1943, the war had turned against Japan. The Americans were advancing across the Pacific with ruthless determination, seizing one island after another. Each victory brought them closer to the homeland, and each defeat pushed Nagumo further into the shadows. He took command of the Central Pacific Area Fleet, responsible for defending a crumbling perimeter of islands. It was a post meant more for honor than victory. Supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and Tokyo's orders had shifted from attack to delay. Nagumo knew what that meant. He was to sacrifice everything to slow the inevitable. His subordinates noticed the change in him. Once rigid and formal, Nagumo grew withdrawn. He rarely spoke during meals, spending hours alone staring at charts that showed Japan's empire shrinking by the day. The same man who had commanded the world's most powerful carrier fleet now watched helplessly as American carriers ruled the skies he once dominated. Reports from the front arrived daily. Guadalcanal lost, the Solomon Islands under siege, and Allied submarines strangling Japan's shipping lanes. Nagumo, ever the realist, understood what others refused to say aloud. The war was lost. But for a man raised in the Imperial Navy's code of honor, surrender was not an option. Then came the order that sealed his fate. In early 1944, he was reassigned to the Marianas to defend the islands of Saipan and Tinian, Japan's last major bastion before the homeland. It was a desperate assignment, but Nagumo accepted it without protest. He knew why he had been chosen. Tokyo needed a symbol, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, to inspire the defenders. But deep down, he must have known the truth. He wasn't being sent to win, he was being sent to die. For the Americans, Saipan would be another step toward Tokyo. For Nagumo, it would be the end of his long, tragic journey, from the deck of the Akagi at Pearl Harbor to the caves of Saipan, where the full weight of vengeance was waiting. By June 1944, Saipan had become the beating heart of Japan's final defensive line, and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was trapped in its rhythm. From the moment he arrived, the island felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. American bombers thundered overhead day and night, softening the beaches for the inevitable invasion. The sea that once carried his fleet now delivered destruction in endless waves, shells, torpedoes, and carrier-based aircraft that blotted out the sun. Nagumo took command of the naval garrison, but his fleet was a shadow of its former self. Grounded aircraft, a handful of anti-air batteries, and sailors with no ships left to sail. Still, Tokyo demanded miracles. "Defend Saipan to the last man," came the order from the Imperial General Staff. Nagumo knew what those words meant. They weren't instructions. They were a death sentence. As American warships closed in, Nagumo walked through the defensive tunnels carved into the coral hillsides. The air was heavy with humidity and fear. Japanese soldiers, young and trembling, saluted him as he passed, their faces gaunt from hunger and malaria. Many had no illusions about what awaited them. Supplies were scarce, and morale was collapsing faster than the bunkers being bombed above them. In the dark, Nagumo heard the distant rumble of naval guns pounding the shoreline. Each explosion drew closer, and each tremor reminded him of the fate that had been building since Midway. On June 15, 1944, the U.S. Marines landed. The beaches erupted into chaos as waves of Higgins boats delivered thousands of men under the cover of naval artillery. Nagumo's defenses were shattered within hours. The Americans poured inland, their tanks grinding over trenches and bunkers. The defenders fought ferociously, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The Japanese airfields were reduced to ash, and communication with Tokyo was nearly gone. In the tunnels beneath Saipan, Nagumo's command devolved into silence. He received word that Vice Admiral Takeo Takashima had been killed by artillery fire, leaving Nagumo the senior officer on the island. It was both an honor and a curse. He now bore the full weight of command, but there was nothing left to command. His troops were broken, his supplies gone, his fate sealed. The sound of American flamethrowers igniting the caves grew louder each day, the screams of the dying echoing through the tunnels. Nagumo's aides urged him to flee to the northern ridges, but he refused. There was nowhere left to run, and in the Imperial Navy, retreat was worse than death. For the Americans, Saipan was a strategic conquest. For Nagumo, it was Judgment Day. He had once sent the U.S. Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the sea. Now the sea itself roared back to claim him. The admiral who had risen to fame through surprise and precision was now buried beneath chaos and inevitability. He knew what was coming, and he would face it, not as a commander of ships, but as a condemned man waiting for his final order from history itself. By the fifth day of battle, Saipan had become unrecognizable. The lush green island was now a landscape of ash and ruin, filled with the stench of smoke, blood, and burning oil. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo moved through his underground command post in near silence, his uniform soaked in sweat, his once polished boots coated with dust. Every few minutes, the ground shuddered from American naval shells pounding the ridges above. Radios crackled with fragments of desperate transmissions, units overrun, ammunition gone, positions lost. Nagumo's aides pleaded with him to move to a safer location, but he only shook his head. "A commander must remain with his men," he said quietly, the same conviction that had driven him into this trap, now anchoring him to it. Outside, the Americans were tightening their grip. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had pushed inland, meeting fierce but futile resistance from Japanese soldiers fighting to the death. Many refused to surrender, launching suicidal charges at night that ended in slaughter. The bodies of Japanese troops carpeted the sugarcane fields, and still they came, driven by the same code that now bound Nagumo's fate. Better death than dishonor was not just a slogan. It was a doctrine carved into their souls. Nagumo could hear the distant shouts and explosions, knowing that every battle outside brought the Americans closer to the caves. Tokyo's final message arrived on June 23rd. It offered no strategy, no reinforcement, only a command. "You will die with honor." Nagumo read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in his pocket. He knew that his death would be meaningless in military terms, but to the Japanese high command, it meant preserving the illusion of loyalty and strength. His thoughts, though, were not of glory. Those who knew him said he appeared calm but distant, as if already halfway gone. Perhaps he thought of the ships he had lost at Midway, of the faces of his pilots who never came home, or of the morning in 1941 when he gave the order to strike Pearl Harbor. The same sea that had carried him to triumph now thundered against the cliffs outside his cave, a grim reminder of the circle closing around him. American soldiers were only a few hundred yards away, their flamethrowers clearing out bunkers one by one. Inside the cave, Nagumo bowed to his aides, thanked them for their service, and gave his final order: "Do your duty as I do mine." Moments later, the sound of a single pistol shot echoed faintly through the tunnels. When U.S. Marines reached the cave, they found the Admiral's body sitting upright against the rock wall, his service pistol still in his hand. His face, witnesses said, looked peaceful, resigned. The man who had once brought America to its knees had met his end not in battle, but in silence. For Japan, his suicide was heralded as an act of honor. For the Americans, it was poetic justice. The hunter of Pearl Harbor had become the hunted, and fate had delivered its verdict without mercy. When news of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's death reached Tokyo, it spread through the corridors of the Imperial Navy like a ghost. Officially, it was reported as a noble act of self-sacrifice, a commander choosing death over capture. Newspapers printed his portrait framed in black ink, calling him a martyr of the empire. But among the senior officers who knew the truth, his suicide felt less like glory and more like a requiem. Nagumo had been one of Japan's most visible symbols of power, and now his death marked something far greater: the death of Japan's naval supremacy. The same admiral who had launched the first strike at Pearl Harbor had ended his life in a cave, hunted, broken, and alone. For the Japanese people, that image was too painful to fully comprehend. In the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito was said to have fallen into a long silence when informed of Nagumo's fate. He had once personally decorated the admiral for his triumph at Pearl Harbor. Now, the empire's most loyal servant had become another casualty of a war that was crumbling from within. The morale in the fleet collapsed further. Younger officers whispered that if even Nagumo, the hero of Hawaii, could die in defeat, then Japan itself had no hope left. It wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the loss of an illusion. For the Americans, Nagumo's death was reported bluntly in wartime briefings. Enemy commander, deceased, Saipan. But within the U.S. Navy, there was a quiet satisfaction. Some of the men who had survived Pearl Harbor were still serving, and when word spread that the architect of that attack had finally fallen, it felt like closure. For them, this was more than another victory. It was personal. The long arc of vengeance that had begun on December 7, 1941, had finally come full circle. The man who once sent waves of aircraft to destroy the Pacific Fleet had been cornered by those same forces and left to die in the darkness. In the ruins of Saipan, Marines discovered Nagumo's effects: his pistol, his sword, and a set of personal papers burned at the edges. Among them was a single line written in his hand: "I have done my duty to the end." It was neither boast nor excuse, just resignation. His body was later buried with military honors by the Americans, a rare gesture of respect for a fallen enemy. The irony was profound. The man whose surprise attack had once defined dishonor in American eyes was now granted a burial fit for a soldier. Back in Japan, however, the truth was quietly rewritten. His suicide was framed as an honorable end, his defeats glossed over in patriotic speeches. But for those who had served under him, Nagumo's story was a cautionary one, a tale of pride, hesitation, and the crushing weight of command. He had lived by the code of Bushido, and in the end, that same code demanded his death. To the Americans, it was justice served. To the Japanese, it was tragedy fulfilled. And to history, it was the moment when vengeance and honor collided in the same cave on Saipan, echoing long after the war's guns fell silent. In the aftermath of Saipan, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's death became both a symbol and a warning, one that echoed through the rest of the Pacific campaign. For Japan, it marked a spiritual collapse. Saipan had been more than just a military stronghold, it was the final shield before the homeland itself. When it fell, the Imperial Command knew what it meant. The American advance could now reach Tokyo, and the myth of Japan's invincibility was shattered beyond repair. In the ashes of that defeat, Nagumo's suicide was presented as proof that the old warrior spirit still lived. But everyone knew the truth. It was desperation dressed as honor. Across the Pacific, the United States celebrated Saipan as a turning point. Newspapers ran headlines proclaiming "Gateway to Japan captured," while military briefings cited it as one of the most decisive victories of the war. Yet, for many in uniform, there was a quieter emotion beneath the triumph: vindication. The same islands that once symbolized humiliation at Pearl Harbor were now symbols of retribution. Every American pilot who looked down at the burning cliffs of Saipan knew that somewhere in those tunnels, the architect of their nation's darkest day had met his end. The circle had closed. The war had not forgiven. But history is never so simple. In time, even Nagumo's enemies would look back on him with something resembling pity. He was not a monster, not a fanatical ideologue, but a naval officer trapped by duty, politics, and tradition. He had carried out his orders with precision, even when he disagreed with them. He had obeyed Yamamoto at Pearl Harbor, and he had obeyed Tokyo at Saipan. The tragedy of Nagumo's life was not in his death, but in how little control he ever truly had. Every major decision that defined him was forced upon him by a system that valued loyalty over logic and sacrifice over survival. As the war dragged on, his name faded into the background, overshadowed by newer disasters, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But to those who had served beside him, Nagumo's ghost lingered. They spoke of him in quiet tones, remembering a man who had started a storm he could never escape. His rise at Pearl Harbor and his fall at Saipan became bookends to Japan's fate, two acts of the same tragedy, bound together by pride, vengeance, and inevitability. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, American officials reviewing captured documents noted Nagumo's final message. One admiral reportedly whispered, "He knew it was over long before the rest of them did." And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all, that the man who began the Pacific War also understood, sooner than anyone else, exactly how it would end.